Some people walk into your life and everything inside you screams to run. Your body tightens, your breath gets shallow. You don't know why, but something deep in your gut tells you this person is dangerous. And sometimes, just sometimes, that feeling is completely wrong. This is the story of a woman who trusted her fear more than her eyes, and a man who refused to prove himself with words because he knew that words are cheap. He chose distance. He chose silence. And in that silence, he built something so loud that even she couldn't ignore it. Before you judge either of them, listen to the whole story. Because the truth is never what it looks like from the outside. There was a small town in Northern California, not far from the Oregon border, where the land was flat and golden in summer and grey and cold in winter. The kind of town where everybody knew everybody, where news traveled faster than the wind, and where people had long memories. It was the kind of place where your grandfather's reputation still followed you around like a shadow, and where people smiled at you on the street but whispered about you the moment you turned the corner. In this town, there lived a woman named Clara. She was 32 years old, had 2 young children, and worked at the only grocery store within 20 miles. She was not a remarkable woman in the way the world usually measures things. She didn't have a college degree. She didn't have a fancy car or a big house. What she had was a heart that had been broken so many times that she had learned to build walls around it so high that not even sunlight could get through. Clara had grown up in a home where love was a word people said, but never showed. Her father had been a drinker, a man whose moods changed like the weather and whose hands were heavy when the bottle was empty. Her mother had stayed because she didn't know any other way to live. Clara watched this as a child, and she made a promise to herself that she would never let a man control her. She would never let a man make her feel small. She would never let a man make her afraid. But promises made in childhood have a strange way of breaking when life gets hard. Clara married young. She was barely 20 when she said yes to a man named Dale, a truck driver who had a good smile and a bad temper. For the first year, things were fine. Dale was kind when he wanted to be, and Clara was hopeful because that is what young hearts do. They hope. But by the second year, the kindness came less and the anger came more. Dale didn't hit her, not at first. He used words instead. He told her she was stupid. He told her she was lucky to have him because no one else would want her. He told her she couldn't do anything right. And slowly, like water wearing down a stone, Clara started to believe him. By the time the children came, Clara had forgotten what it felt like to be brave. She had forgotten what it felt like to speak up. She had forgotten what it felt like to believe in herself. Dale controlled everything. The money, the car, the phone, even the way she dressed. And when Clara finally found the courage to leave, it was not because she suddenly became strong. It was because Dale hit their son. Not hard, but hard enough. And something inside Clara, something old and fierce and buried deep, woke up and said, "No, not my children. Never my children." She packed 2 bags in the middle of the night, put the kids in the car, and drove until the gas ran out. That's how she ended up in this small town near the border. A woman with nothing but 2 children and a heart full of fear. The local church helped her find a place to stay, a small apartment above an old hardware store. The grocery store gave her a job. And slowly, one day at a time, Clara started to rebuild her life. But the fear never left. It lived inside her like a second heartbeat. Every time a man raised his voice, she flinched. Every time a man stood too close, she stepped back. Every time a man looked at her too long, she looked away. She didn't hate men. She feared them. And in her mind, that fear was not a weakness. It was wisdom. It was survival. It was the only thing that had kept her and her children safe. This was Clara's world when she first heard about the man they called the Modoc. His real name was Joseph Riddle, but nobody called him that. Everybody called him the Modoc because his grandmother had been a full-blooded Modoc woman, and because Joseph carried himself with a kind of quiet pride that reminded the old folks of the Modoc people who had once lived on this land. He was 36 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that he kept long and tied back, and hands that were rough from years of hard work. He worked on a ranch outside of town, did odd jobs for people who needed things fixed, and lived alone in a small cabin near the river. The Modoc was not a man who talked much. He was the kind of man who could sit in a room full of people and say nothing for hours, and somehow still be the most noticeable person there. There was something about him that drew attention. Maybe it was the way he moved, slow and deliberate, like every step had a purpose. Maybe it was his eyes, dark and deep and steady, the kind of eyes that seemed to see right through you. Or maybe it was the stories people told about him, stories that had grown and twisted over the years until nobody really knew what was true and what was not. Some people said the Modoc had been in prison. Some said he had been in the military and had done terrible things overseas. Some said he had a temper that could turn violent without warning. Some said he had once beaten a man so badly that the man had to be airlifted to a hospital in Reading. And some said he was just a quiet man who kept to himself and didn't bother anybody. Clara heard all these stories, and she believed the worst ones, not because she had any evidence, not because she had ever spoken to the Modoc or seen him do anything wrong, but because her fear told her to believe them. Her fear whispered in her ear the way it always did, telling her that men who were big and quiet and strong were the most dangerous kind. The kind who could hurt you before you even saw it coming. The kind who smiled at you one moment and destroyed you the next. The first time Clara actually saw the Modoc was on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He came into the grocery store to buy supplies. She was behind the register, and when she looked up and saw him walking toward her, her whole body went cold. He was bigger than she had imagined. His presence filled the space around him the way a storm fills the sky. He placed his items on the counter without a word. Canned beans, rice, coffee, bread, simple things. Clara rang them up with shaking hands. She didn't look at his face. She kept her eyes on the items, on the register, on anything but him. When she told him the total, her voice cracked. The Modoc looked at her for a long moment, not in a threatening way, not in a hungry way. Just looked at her the way you might look at a bird that had flown into a window and was lying stunned on the ground. Then he nodded, paid in cash, picked up his bags, and left without a word. That night, Clara locked her door 3 times and checked the windows twice. She told herself she was being careful. She told herself she was being smart. But deep down, she knew she was just being afraid. The Modoc started coming into the store once a week, always on Tuesday, always in the afternoon. He always bought the same kinds of things, simple food, basic supplies. He never said more than a few words. Please, thank you. That's all. He was polite in a way that was almost formal, like someone who had learnt manners from a book rather than from people. Clara served him each time with the same tight smile and the same shaking hands. And each time the Modoc looked at her with those steady eyes, and each time she looked away. One Tuesday, something different happened. Clara's son Marcus, who was 7 years old, was sitting in the corner of the store doing his homework because the after-school program was full that day. When the Modoc walked in, Marcus looked up and stared at him with the fearless curiosity that only children have. The Modoc noticed the boy and did something Clara had never seen him do before. He smiled, not a big smile, just a small one, barely there, like sunlight breaking through a crack in the clouds. He raised his hand and gave the boy a small wave. Marcus waved back. Clara saw this, and instead of feeling comforted, she felt terrified. She moved quickly to stand between the Modoc and her son. She rang up his items faster than usual, almost shoving the change into his hand. The Modoc noticed. He looked at Clara, then at Marcus, then back at Clara. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't anger. It wasn't offense. It was something quieter and sadder, like understanding, like recognition, like he had seen this look before and knew exactly what it meant. He picked up his bags, said thank you, and left. That night, Clara's friend Maggie came over for coffee. Maggie was one of the few people in town that Clara actually trusted. She was a loud, warm, no-nonsense woman who worked at the post office and knew everything about everyone. Clara told Maggie about the Modoc, about the way he had smiled at Marcus, about the way it had made her feel. Maggie listened, then set down her coffee cup and looked Clara straight in the eyes. She said that Joseph Riddle was one of the most decent men in this town. She said she had known him for 15 years. She told Clara that he had never raised his hand to anyone who didn't deserve it. She said the stories about him were mostly garbage, made up by people who were afraid of anyone different from them. Clara shook her head. She said she didn't care. She said she had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts told her that the Modoc was dangerous. Maggie sighed and said that sometimes what we call instincts are really just old wounds talking. She said that sometimes fear doesn't protect us but instead keeps us locked in a prison of our own making. Clara didn't argue. She just changed the subject. But that night, after Maggie left, she lay awake in bed thinking about what her friend had said. Old wounds talking, a prison of her own making. She pushed the thoughts away and pulled the blankets tighter around her, as if they could protect her from the truth. Weeks passed. The Modoc kept coming to the store every Tuesday. Clara kept serving him with the same polite distance. But something was changing, slowly, like the seasons. She started noticing things she hadn't noticed before. The way the Modoc always held the door open for other customers. The way he once helped old Mrs. Patterson carry her bags to her car without being asked. The way he always said please and thank you. The way he never raised his voice, never crowded her space, never did anything that should have made her afraid. But she was afraid anyway, because fear doesn't need a reason. Fear is its own reason. Then one day, something happened that changed everything. It was a Saturday morning, and Clara was walking with her children to the small park near the center of town. Marcus was running ahead, the way boys do, full of energy and carelessness, when he tripped on a crack in the sidewalk and went down hard. He scraped both his knees and his palms, and he started crying the way children cry when they are more surprised than hurt. Clara rushed to him, but before she could get there, someone else was already kneeling beside her son. It was the Modoc. He had been walking on the other side of the street and had crossed over when he saw the boy fall. He was crouched down next to Marcus, not touching him, just talking to him in a low, calm voice. Clara couldn't hear what he was saying at first. When she got closer, she heard him telling Marcus about a time when he was a boy, and he had fallen off a horse and scraped his whole side raw. He said it had hurt so bad he thought he was going to die, but his grandmother had told him that pain was just the body's way of telling you that you are alive. And being alive, she had said, was always a good thing. Marcus had stopped crying. He was looking up at the Modoc with wide eyes, listening the way children listen when someone is telling them the truth. Clara reached them and pulled Marcus to her. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything. She just grabbed her son and her daughter and walked away as fast as she could. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were shaking. She could feel the Modoc's eyes on her back as she walked, and she hated herself for being afraid, and hated him for making her feel that way. The Modoc stood up slowly. He watched her go. And then he did something that Clara would not learn about until much later. He went home to his cabin, sat on his porch, and made a decision. He decided that he would stay away from Clara and her children. Not because he was angry, not because he was offended, but because he understood something that most people never learn. He understood that you cannot force someone to stop being afraid of you. You cannot argue your way out of someone's fear. You cannot prove your goodness by pushing yourself into the life of someone who doesn't want you there. The only thing you can do is give them space, give them distance, and let your life speak for itself. The next Tuesday, the Modoc did not come to the grocery store. Clara noticed, though she told herself she didn't care. The Tuesday after that, he didn't come either. Or the Tuesday after that. Weeks went by, and the Modoc was nowhere to be seen. Clara heard from Maggie that he was getting his supplies delivered from a store in the next town over, driving an extra 40 minutes each way just to buy his groceries. When Clara asked why, Maggie gave her a long look and said that maybe he was trying to make someone feel safe. Clara felt something then, something she couldn't name. It was not guilt exactly, though guilt was part of it. It was not curiosity exactly, though curiosity was part of it too. It was something deeper, something that pressed against the walls she had built around her heart and whispered that maybe, just maybe, those walls were keeping out more than danger. Maybe they were keeping out life itself. But she was not ready to listen, not yet. She pushed the feeling down the way she always did, and she went on with her life, working, raising her children, surviving. Because that's what Clara knew how to do, survive. She didn't know yet that there was a difference between surviving and living, but she was about to learn. And the teacher would be the very man she feared the most. Winter came early that year. The kind of winter that doesn't knock on the door but kicks it in. The temperatures dropped below freezing in November, and by December, the ground was hard as stone and the sky was a permanent shade of iron grey. The small town near the border turned quiet the way it always did in winter. People moving fast between their cars and their front doors, heads down against the wind, nobody stopping to talk on the street anymore. Clara felt the cold more than most people, not just in her body, but in her life. The heating in her apartment above the hardware store was old and unreliable. Some nights it worked and some nights it didn't. And on the nights it didn't, she would pile every blanket she owned on top of her children and sit in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching the steam rise and disappear into the dark, cold air. She didn't complain. Complaining required someone to complain too. And Clara had learned a long time ago that the world didn't care much about the problems of a single mother with no money and no family. Her landlord, a man named Gerald who owned the hardware store below, was supposed to fix the heating. He said he would get to it. He said it every week. But Gerald was the kind of man who made promises the way some people make paper airplanes, just to watch them fly for a moment before they crashed. Clara couldn't push too hard because the rent was cheap and she couldn't afford to lose the apartment. So she waited and she shivered, and she told her children that the cold was an adventure. Marcus, her 7-year-old, didn't mind so much. He was a tough kid, the kind of boy who would play outside in any weather and come home with red cheeks and a big grin. But her daughter, Lily, who was only 4, got sick in the second week of December. A cough that started small and grew bigger every day until it sounded like something was loose and rattling inside her tiny chest. Clara took her to the clinic, and the doctor said it was bronchitis and gave them antibiotics and said to keep her warm. Keep her warm. As if Clara wasn't trying. The antibiotics helped, but the cough lingered. Every night, Clara lay awake listening to her daughter cough in the dark, and every night she felt the helplessness that is the worst thing a parent can feel. The feeling that you would do anything, give anything, sacrifice anything to make your child well, and yet there is nothing you can do but wait and hope and pray to whatever God might be listening. It was during this time that Clara started hearing things about the Modoc again. Not the old stories, not the rumors about prison and violence. New things. Small things. Things that came to her in pieces, like a puzzle assembling itself without her permission. Maggie told her one evening over coffee that the Modoc had spent 2 weekends rebuilding the porch of the community center that had been falling apart for years. Nobody had asked him to do it. Nobody had paid him. He just showed up one Saturday morning with his tools and his truck and started working. When the pastor came out and asked him what he was doing, the Modoc had simply said that it needed fixing. That was all. It needed fixing. Then Clara heard from the woman at the laundromat that the Modoc had been delivering firewood to some of the older folks in town who couldn't chop their own, free of charge. Just stacking it neatly by their doors and leaving before they could even thank him properly. Addison said she had woken up one morning to find her entire woodpile restocked and a bag of groceries on her step, and the only reason she knew it was the Modoc was because she had seen his truck pulling away down the road. Clara listened to these stories and felt that unnamed feeling again, the one that pressed against her walls and whispered things she didn't want to hear. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that bad men could do good things when they wanted something. Dale had done good things too. In the beginning, he had brought her flowers and cooked her dinner and told her she was beautiful. And then he had spent years tearing her apart piece by piece. Good deeds meant nothing if the heart behind them was rotten. But there was a difference between Dale's kindness and what the Modoc was doing. And somewhere deep inside, Clara knew it. Dale's kindness had always been for show. It had always come with strings. It had always been a performance, a way to make himself look good or to buy Clara's silence after a bad night. The Modoc wasn't performing for anyone. He was doing these things quietly, without audience, without expectation. He was doing them for people who could give him nothing in return. And more than that, he was doing them while staying completely away from Clara, respecting the distance she had silently demanded. That was the part she couldn't stop thinking about. He had chosen to drive 40 minutes to buy groceries from another town. 40 minutes there, and 40 minutes back every single week, just so she wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable behind her register. Just so she wouldn't have to stand there with shaking hands and a tight smile, pretending she wasn't afraid. He had noticed her fear, and instead of getting angry or offended or defensive, he had simply stepped back. Clara had never met a man who stepped back. The men in her life had always pushed forward. Her father pushed forward with his fists. Dale pushed forward with his words. Even the men who weren't trying to hurt her pushed forward in smaller ways, taking up space, demanding attention, expecting something. The Modoc had done the opposite. He had made himself smaller so that she could feel bigger. He had given up his convenience so that she could have her peace. She didn't know what to do with that. Christmas came and went. Clara made the best of it for her children. She bought Marcus a second-hand basketball from the thrift store and Lily a stuffed rabbit that was missing one eye but was soft and clean. The kids didn't care that the gifts were small. They were happy because children have a gift for finding joy in the middle of nothing. Clara watched them on Christmas morning, tearing into the wrapping paper she had made from grocery bags, and she smiled even though her heart ached. On the day after Christmas, something happened that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. She came downstairs in the morning to go to work and found a large box sitting outside the door to her apartment. It was heavy and plain, with no name on it, no card, no note. She opened it carefully, half expecting something bad because that was how her mind worked, always expecting the worst. Inside the box, she found a brand new portable heater, still in its original packaging. A good one, not the cheap kind that breaks after a week, the kind that could heat a small apartment and keep it warm all night. Underneath the heater there was a thick wool blanket, soft and heavy, the color of dark red wine. And underneath the blanket there was a small paper bag filled with honey lemon cough drops, the kind the doctor had recommended for Lily's cough. Clara stood there in the cold morning air, holding the box, and she felt something break inside her, not in a bad way. In the way that ice breaks in the spring, cracking and shifting and letting the water flow underneath. Someone had thought about her. Someone had paid attention. Someone knew about the heating and the cold and Lily's cough and had done something about it without asking for a single thing in return. She knew who it was. She didn't want to know, but she knew. There was only one person in this town who did things like this, quietly and without a name. Only one person who would know about the heating because he did odd jobs for people all over town and would have heard about Gerald's laziness. Only one person who would know about Lily's cough because Maggie talked to everybody and the Modoc listened. Clara carried the box upstairs. She set up the heater. She wrapped Lily in the blanket. She gave her a cough drop and watched the relief spread across her daughter's small face. And then she sat down on the kitchen floor and cried. Not sad tears, not happy tears, confused tears. The kind of tears that come when the world you have built inside your head starts to crack, and you can see light coming through, but you are not sure yet if that light is safe. She cried because she had feared this man. She had looked at him and seen a monster, and he had responded by warming her children. January came, and with it a new kind of coldness. Not the weather this time, but something harder. Dale found them. Clara didn't know how. She had been so careful. She had left no trail, told no one from her old life where she was going. But Dale was the kind of man who didn't let go of things that he believed belonged to him. And in his mind, Clara and the children were his property, not his family. Property, something to own and control and use as he pleased. He showed up on a Friday afternoon. Clara was walking home from the store with the kids when she saw his truck parked outside the hardware store. That truck, the black Ford with a dent in the tailgate, the same truck she had heard pulling into the driveway on all those terrible nights, the same truck that sounded like a warning. Her blood went cold. Her legs went weak. She grabbed both children's hands and pulled them around the corner, pressing them against the wall of the building. Marcus looked up at her with wide eyes and asked what was wrong. Clara couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up the way it used to close up when Dale came home drunk, and she could hear his boots on the stairs. She knelt down and told the children in a whisper that they were going to play a game. They were going to be very quiet and go to Maggie's house instead of going home. Marcus was old enough to understand that this was not a game. He nodded without a word and took his sister's hand. They made it to Maggie's house through the back streets, and Maggie took one look at Clara's face and pulled them all inside. Clara told her. Dale was here. He had found them. Maggie's face went hard and she picked up the phone and called the sheriff's office. But the sheriff, a man named Bill Cooper, told them there wasn't much he could do unless Dale actually did something. He was allowed to be in town. He was allowed to drive his truck. Unless he made a direct threat or broke a law, the sheriff's hands were tied. Clara knew this. She had heard it before, in her old town, when she had tried to get help and been told the same thing. The law protects you after something happens, not before. It punishes the wound but does nothing to stop the knife. That night, Clara and the children stayed at Maggie's house. Clara didn't sleep. She sat in the living room in the dark, watching the street through the window, waiting for the black truck to appear. It didn't, but the fear was there, huge and suffocating, filling every corner of the room. The next day, Dale came to the grocery store. Clara was behind the register, and when she saw him walk through the door, every muscle in her body locked up. He looked the same. Bigger, maybe, heavier, but the same. That smile that could turn from warm to cruel in a heartbeat. Those eyes that could go from soft to empty in the time it took to blink. He walked up to the counter and said hello like nothing had happened, like she hadn't run from him in the middle of the night, like he hadn't spent years grinding her into dust. He said he missed her. He said the kids needed their father. He said he had changed. Clara had heard all of this before. Every word was a script he had memorized, a play he had performed 100 times. And every time, the ending was the same. Clara told him to leave. Her voice shook, but she said it. He laughed. Not a mean laugh, not yet. The kind of laugh that said he didn't take her seriously. He leaned on the counter and told her they should talk. Just talk. He said he had driven a long way and deserved at least that much. The word deserved hit Clara like a slap. He always thought he deserved things. Her time, her attention, her obedience. She told him again to leave. Louder this time. The other customers were watching. Dale's smile flickered. That flicker was the warning sign Clara knew too well. The moment before the mask dropped. But they were in public, and Dale was smart enough to know that. He raised his hands in a gesture of fake surrender and said he would give her some time. He said he was staying at the motel on Route 9 and she could find him there when she was ready to be reasonable. He walked out. Clara stood behind the register, her hands gripping the counter so hard her knuckles were white. Her co-worker, a young woman named Jessica, came over and asked if she was okay. Clara nodded, but she was not okay. She was falling apart inside, and the walls she had built, the walls that had kept her standing for 2 years, were starting to crumble. Over the next few days, Dale made his presence known. He drove past the hardware store slowly. At different times of day, he showed up at the park when Marcus was playing. He sat in his truck outside the laundromat while Clara was washing clothes. He never said anything threatening. He never did anything that would count as a crime. He just existed, close and constant, like a shadow she couldn't escape. Clara went back to the sheriff. Bill Cooper shook his head and said the same thing. No crime, no action. He could tell Dale to stay away, but he couldn't make him. Clara wanted to scream. She wanted to grab the sheriff by his collar and ask him what exactly Dale needed to do before someone would help her. Did he need to hit her? Did he need to put her in the hospital? Did he need to hurt one of her children? How much pain was the required minimum for the law to care? She didn't say any of that. She just nodded and walked out, because that's what women like Clara had been trained to do. Nod and walk out, accept and endure. Be grateful that things weren't worse yet. It was Maggie who told the Modoc. Clara didn't ask her to. Clara would have been furious if she had known at the time. But Maggie had grown up in this town, and she knew that sometimes the law was not enough and sometimes you needed a different kind of protection. Not violence, not threats. Just the presence of someone who made other people think twice. Maggie found the Modoc at the ranch where he worked and told him what was happening. She told him about Dale, about the truck driving past, about the park, about the laundromat. She told him about Clara's fear, not just of Dale, but of everything, of all men, including the Modoc himself. She said she wasn't asking him to do anything specific. She was just telling him because somebody needed to know and somebody needed to care. The Modoc listened without interrupting. When Maggie finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked one question. He asked where Clara's children went to school. Maggie told him. He nodded and said nothing else. What happened next, Clara didn't learn about until weeks later. The Modoc started parking his truck near the school every morning and every afternoon, arriving before the children got there and leaving after they were picked up. He didn't go inside. He didn't talk to anyone. He just sat in his truck, visible, like a guard dog sleeping with one eye open. He started driving past the hardware store a few times a day, not stopping, just making sure his truck was seen. His truck was well known in town, big and old and loud, and everyone knew who it belonged to. Dale noticed. Of course he noticed, because predators always notice when another predator enters their territory. Except the Modoc wasn't a predator. He was something else entirely. He was a wall. A quiet, immovable wall that didn't attack and didn't threaten, but simply stood there and said, without words, that going further would be a mistake. One evening, Dale was sitting in his truck outside the laundromat when the Modoc pulled up and parked directly across the street. The Modoc didn't get out. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, engine off, window down, looking straight at Dale. Not with aggression, not with challenge, just with steadiness. The kind of look that said, I see you, I know what you are, and I am not going anywhere. Dale sat there for 5 minutes, staring back. Then he started his truck and drove away. He didn't come back to the laundromat. 2 days later, Dale was parked near the park when Marcus was playing. Clara was on the bench, rigid with fear, watching Dale's truck and watching her son, and feeling trapped between the two. Then, the Modoc's truck appeared, slow and deliberate, and parked between Dale and the park entrance, like a shield, like a fence. Dale watched for a minute, then pulled away. Clara saw this. She saw the Modoc's truck and she knew what was happening. And for the first time, instead of fear, she felt something else. She felt a crack in the ice, a shift in the ground beneath her feet. A tiny, fragile, almost invisible seed of something that might one day grow into trust. She didn't act on it. Not yet. The fear was still too strong, the walls still too high. But the seed was there, planted in the cold ground of her heart, waiting for spring. Dale left town 10 days after the Modoc started his quiet patrol. He didn't leave with a dramatic exit, no confrontation, no showdown. He just disappeared the way cowards do when they realize that the game they are playing has a new player, and this new player doesn't follow their rules. Clara came home one evening and the black truck was gone from the motel parking lot, gone from the streets, gone from the park and the laundromat and the school. Just gone. She stood outside the hardware store, looking at the empty street, and she took a breath so deep it hurt. The kind of breath you take when you've been holding it for weeks and you didn't even know it. The air was cold and clean, and it filled her lungs like freedom. That night she put the children to bed and sat in the kitchen with the heater the Modoc had given her humming softly in the corner, and she thought about things she hadn't allowed herself to think about in a very long time. She thought about what it meant when someone protected you without asking for anything. She thought about what it meant when someone chose to be strong on your behalf without trying to own you. She thought about what it meant when someone saw your fear and instead of being offended by it, simply worked around it, like water flowing around a stone. And she thought about the Modoc, out there in his cabin by the river, alone in the cold, a man who had been called dangerous by people who didn't know him, and a monster by a woman who had never given him a chance. A man who had answered fear with kindness, suspicion with patience, and rejection with grace. Clara wasn't ready to knock on his door. She wasn't ready to say thank you. She wasn't ready to trust, but she was ready to wonder. And sometimes, wondering is the first step toward everything. Spring took its time that year, like it was testing the patience of everyone in town. February dragged itself through grey days and frozen mornings, and March wasn't much better. But by the middle of April, the earth softened and the trees started to wake up, and the sky turned from iron to pale blue, and the whole town seemed to exhale after months of holding its breath. Clara felt the change in the air, and she felt it inside herself too. Something had been shifting since Dale left, slowly and quietly, like a river changing its course underground where nobody could see it. She was still afraid. Fear doesn't pack up and leave just because the thing you are afraid of goes away. Fear has roots, deep ones, and those roots had been growing inside Clara for so many years that they were tangled up with everything else, with her thoughts and her feelings and her sense of who she was. But the roots were loosening. Just a little. Just enough for something new to push through. She started asking questions about the Modoc. Not openly. Not to just anyone. She asked Maggie because Maggie was safe. She asked in the same careful way a person tests the ice before stepping onto a frozen lake. One small question at a time, ready to pull back at the first crack. She asked Maggie how long she had known him. Maggie said since he was a young man, barely 20, when he came to this town with nothing but a bag and a bad reputation that wasn't even his. She asked what she meant by that. Maggie leaned back in her chair and told Clara the story she had never thought to ask for. Joseph Riddle had grown up on the Modoc Reservation up near Tool Lake Arts. His mother had died when he was small, a car accident on a wet road in November, and his father had fallen apart after that, fell into the bottle, and never climbed out. Joseph was raised mostly by his grandmother, a Modoc woman named Ruth who had survived things that would have destroyed most people. She had been sent to a boarding school as a child, one of those government schools where they cut your hair and beat your language out of you and told you that everything about who you were was wrong. Ruth survived that and came home and rebuilt herself from the pieces they had left behind. She raised Joseph with stories and strength and a quiet kind of love. that didn't need to announce itself. But the reservation was a hard place. Poverty, addiction, violence that grew out of generations of pain that had never been healed. Joseph got into trouble as a teenager. Fights mostly. He was big for his age and angry in the way that young men are angry when they can feel that the world has dealt them a bad hand but can't yet understand why. He got arrested twice. Once for fighting and once for stealing a truck that belonged to a man who owed his father money. Neither charge stuck, but the record followed him like a stain that wouldn't wash out. When Joseph was 19, his father died. Cirrhosis. The same slow poison that had been killing him for years finally finished the job. Joseph found him on the kitchen floor on a Monday morning and sat there beside him for 3 hours before he called anyone. Not because he didn't know what to do, because he needed to say goodbye to the man his father had been before the bottle took him. He needed to remember the man who had once carried him on his shoulders through a field of wildflowers and told him that the Modoc people had walked this land for 10,000 years and that as long as Joseph remembered that, he would never truly be lost. After his father's funeral, Ruth sat Joseph down and told him something that would change his life. She told him that he had 2 paths in front of him. One path led to the same place his father had ended up, on a floor, alone, destroyed by the weight of pain he couldn't put down. The other path led somewhere else, somewhere Ruth couldn't see but believed existed, a place where Joseph could be the man he was meant to be, instead of the man the world expected him to be. She told him that the choice was his, and that she would love him no matter which path he chose, but that she was old and tired and it would break her heart to bury another person she loved before her time. Joseph left the reservation the next week. He came to this small town near the border because Ruth had a cousin here, a woman named Alice who worked at the ranch. Alice got Joseph a job. He worked hard, harder than anyone on the ranch had seen a young man work in years. He kept his head down and his mouth shut and his hands busy. He didn't drink. He didn't fight. He went to work and came home and sat on the porch of the small cabin Alice had helped him find and read books by lamplight because the cabin didn't have electricity for the first 2 years. The stories about him, the prison stories, the violent stories, those grew on their own, the way weeds grow in an untended garden. People saw a big, quiet, dark-skinned man with a reservation background and a criminal record, and they filled in the blanks with whatever their fear told them. Joseph knew what people said about him. He heard the whispers. He saw the way some people crossed the street when he walked toward them. He felt the weight of their assumptions like stones piled on his back, but he didn't fight it. Not because he didn't care, but because Ruth had taught him that a man's character is not what people say about him, but what he does when nobody is watching. She had told him that the Modoc people had survived centuries of being misunderstood and mistreated by standing firm in who they were, not by arguing, not by fighting, by being, by living their truth so loudly that eventually even the deaf could hear it. That was what Joseph did. He lived. He worked. He helped people. He fixed things that were broken and built things that were needed, and gave what he could to those who had less. And slowly, over years, the people who actually knew him came to see him for who he was. Not all of them. There were still people in town who crossed the street, still people who believed the old stories, but enough people knew the truth that Joseph had a life here, a real one, built on something solid. Maggie told Clara all of this, and Clara sat there with her coffee growing cold in her hands and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She felt shame, hot and sharp, rising in her chest. She had looked at this man and seen a monster. She had taken her own pain and her own fear and projected it onto him like a movie onto a blank screen, and the movie she had been watching was never about him at all. It was about her father. It was about Dale. It was about every man who had ever hurt her. She had wrapped all that pain around Joseph Riddle like a coat that didn't belong to him, and then judged him for wearing it. Clara asked Maggie one more question. She asked if the Modoc knew about her past, about Dale and the hitting and the running. Maggie was quiet for a moment, then said, yes. She said she had told him after Dale showed up in town because he needed to understand why he was helping. Clara felt exposed, like someone had opened a window into a room she'd kept locked for years. But underneath the exposure, there was something else, relief. Because if the Modoc knew her story and still chose to help, still chose kindness, still chose distance instead of demands, then maybe his goodness wasn't an act. Maybe it was just who he was. April turned to May. and Clara made a decision. Not a big one, not a dramatic one. A small decision, the kind that feels like nothing when you make it but turns out to be everything when you look back. She baked a pie, apple, because that's what she knew how to make. Her mother, for all her faults, had taught Clara to make an apple pie that could make a grown man cry. Clara hadn't baked one in years. She had stopped doing things that brought her joy a long time ago because joy felt dangerous, like something that could be taken away. But she baked this pie on a Saturday morning while her children were playing in the living room. And when it came out of the oven golden and perfect, she wrapped it in a clean dish towel and put it in a box. Then she drove to the Modoc's cabin. The road to his place was unpaved and rough, winding through trees that were just starting to leaf out, all soft green and new. The cabin sat near the river, small and simple, with a porch that ran along the front and a garden on the side that was freshly turned and ready for planting. There was firewood stacked neatly against the wall, enough for another winter. The Modoc's truck was parked out front. Clara sat in her car for 10 minutes. Her hands were on the steering wheel and her heart was in her throat, and every instinct she had was screaming at her to turn around and go home. The old fear was there, loud and insistent, telling her she was making a mistake, telling her she didn't know this man, telling her that kindness was just another trap. But there was a new voice now, quieter than the fear, but steady, a voice that sounded like it might be her own, the real her, the one who had been buried under years of survival. That voice said that she had been running long enough. That voice said that the walls she had built were keeping her alive but not letting her live. That voice said that trust doesn't come all at once. It comes in small steps, and this was just one small step. She got out of the car. The Modoc came onto the porch before she reached it. He must have heard her pull up. He stood there, tall and still, with an expression she couldn't read. Not surprise exactly, something closer to patience, the look of someone who has been waiting for something without knowing if it would ever arrive. Clara stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She held out the box with the pie. Her hands were shaking, and she knew he could see them shaking, and she hated that he could see it, but she didn't pull back. She said she wanted to say thank you. Her voice was thin and unsteady, like a rope bridge in the wind. She said thank you for the heater and the blanket and the cough drops. Thank you for helping with Dale. Thank you for staying away when she needed him to stay away. The Modoc looked at her for a long moment, then came down the steps slowly, the way you approach a wild animal that might bolt. He took the box from her hands gently. He said she didn't owe him anything. He said he didn't do those things to get something back. He said he did them because it was the right thing to do, and because his grandmother had taught him that the measure of a person is what they do for people who can't do anything for them. Clara nodded. She wanted to say more, but the words were stuck somewhere between her chest and her mouth. So she just stood there, and he just stood there. And for a moment the only sound was the river and the wind in the trees, and the birds calling to each other across the water. Then the Modoc did something unexpected. He asked if she and the children liked fish. Clara blinked. He said he had caught some trout that morning and there was too much for one person. He said if she wanted, she could bring the kids by next Saturday and he'd cook it up on the grill. No pressure, he said. Just fish. Clara almost said no. The word was right there, automatic, like a reflex. But she stopped herself. She thought about Marcus, who needed men in his life who were gentle instead of rough. She thought about Lily, who needed to see that not every man was someone to be afraid of. And she thought about herself, about the woman she wanted to be, instead of the woman fear had made her. She said, okay, just fish. The following Saturday, Clara loaded the kids into the car and drove to the cabin. Marcus was excited because he loved fish, and because he remembered the Modoc from the day he fell on the sidewalk, and the man had told him about falling off a horse. Lily was shy and clung to Clara's leg, but she was curious too, the way 4-year-olds are curious about everything. The Modoc had set up a small table on the porch with mismatched plates and glasses that looked like they had been borrowed from different decades. The trout was on the grill and it smelled like smoke and lemon and something green that Clara later learned was a wild herb that grew by the river, one his grandmother had taught him to cook with. He greeted Clara with a nod and the children with a warmth that surprised her. Not forced warmth, not the kind of warmth that people put on like a costume, real warmth, easy and natural, like the sun. Marcus started talking immediately because that's what Marcus did. He asked the Modoc about the horses at the ranch and whether he had ever ridden a bull and whether bears lived near the river. The Modoc answered every question seriously, without talking down to the boy, without the condescending voice some adults use with children. He spoke to Marcus the way you speak to someone you respect, and Marcus responded to that respect by glowing with the kind of happiness that children show when they feel seen. Lily warmed up slower. She stayed close to Clara for the first hour, peeking at the Modoc from behind her mother's arm. But then the Modoc brought out a small wooden box and opened it to show Lily something. Inside the box, there were carved wooden animals. A bear, a deer, an eagle, a fox, each one small enough to fit in a child's hand, each one carved with careful detail. The Modoc said his grandmother had taught him to carve them, and that she used to say that every animal had a spirit, and if you listened closely, the wood would tell you which animal it wanted to become. Lily reached for the fox. She held it up and looked at it with the intense concentration of a child discovering something magical. Then she looked at the Modoc and smiled. It was a small smile, hesitant and careful, but it was real. Clara watched this, and something inside her broke open in a way that didn't hurt. It was the opposite of breaking. It was unbreaking. It was a piece of her that had been shattered for years suddenly fitting back into place. They ate fish on the porch, and the food was simple and good, and the conversation was easy in the way that conversations are easy when nobody is trying to impress anyone. The Modoc told stories about the ranch, about a horse that refused to be ridden by anyone but him, about a coyote that had once stolen his boot right off the porch while he was sleeping. Marcus laughed so hard that milk came out of his nose, and even Clara laughed, a real laugh, one that came from somewhere deep and honest. When it was time to go, the Modoc walked them to the car. Marcus asked if they could come back, and the Modoc looked at Clara with a question in his eyes. Clara said yes, they could come back. They went back the next Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and the one after that. Each time the walls came down a little more. Each time, Clara saw a little more of who the Modoc really was. She saw a man who listened more than he spoke, a man who fixed things quietly and without fanfare, a man who treated her children with a tenderness that made her chest ache because it was the kind of tenderness they deserved from their own father and never got. She saw a man who never pushed, never leaned in too close, never made a move that could be mistaken for pressure. He let Clara set the pace, and whatever pace she set, he matched it. If she was quiet, he was quiet. If she wanted to talk, he listened. If she needed distance, he gave it. If she needed company, he was there. It was like being with someone who had no need to prove anything, who had nothing to take and nothing to hide. And for Clara, who had spent her whole life with men who were always trying to take something or hide something, this was a revelation. Over the weeks and months that followed, Clara learned more about the man behind the name. She learned that he read poetry in the evenings, that his favorite poet was a Modoc writer whose name she couldn't pronounce, but whose words were beautiful and sad and full of the kind of truth that hurts in a good way. She learned that he sent money to his grandmother every month, even though Ruth always told him to keep it. She learned that he had planted a garden every spring since he moved into the cabin. Not because he needed the food, but because Ruth had taught him that putting your hands in the earth was a way of staying connected to the people who had walked on it before you. She learned that he had been lonely, not the kind of loneliness that comes from being alone, because the Modoc was comfortable with solitude, but the deeper kind, the kind that comes from being misunderstood, from being seen as something you are not and having no way to correct the picture because the people doing the seeing have already made up their minds. She understood that loneliness. She had felt it herself from the other side, the loneliness of being seen as weak when you were strong, the loneliness of being seen as a victim when you were a survivor, the loneliness of having a story that nobody bothered to read past the first page. One evening in late summer, Clara and the Modoc were sitting on his porch while the children played by the river. The sun was going down and the sky was the color of ripe peaches and the air smelled like warm grass and wood smoke. Clara looked at the Modoc and said something she had been carrying for months. She said she was sorry. Sorry for being afraid of him. Sorry for judging him. Sorry for looking at him and seeing someone else. The Modoc was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that Clara would carry with her for the rest of her life. He said she didn't need to apologize for her fear. He said fear was honest. It was the most honest thing a person could feel, because it came from a real place of real pain and real experience. He said the problem was never her fear. The problem was the world that gave her reasons to be afraid. He said he was never angry at her. He was angry at the men who came before him, the ones who taught her that big hands were made for hurting instead of holding. He said all he ever wanted was a chance to show her a different truth, not with words. Words were easy. Anyone could say the right things. He wanted to show her with his life. I'll show you who I am. That's what he had said to himself that day when Clara grabbed Marcus and walked away from him in the park. Not to prove her wrong. Not to win anything, just to live in a way that was so honest and so consistent that eventually the truth would speak for itself. And it did. Clara and the Modoc story didn't unfold the way stories do in movies. There was no dramatic kiss, no sudden declaration of love, no moment where everything changed in a single heartbeat. It happened the way real things happen, slowly, imperfectly, one small, brave choice at a time. A pie brought to a porch, a Saturday dinner that became a tradition, a conversation that started with weather and ended with truth, a hand reached out and another hand reaching back, slowly, carefully, each finger finding its place. By the end of that year, Clara was a different woman, not because the Modoc had changed her, but because he had created a space where she could change herself, a space that was safe and patient and free of demands. He hadn't torn down her walls. He had simply stood outside them, quiet and steady, until she felt ready to open the door. Marcus started calling the Modoc by his first name, Joseph, and then, eventually, started calling him something else. A word that made Clara's heart catch every time she heard it. The word was not forced. Marcus chose it on his own, the way children choose things, with an instinct that is purer and truer than anything adults are capable of. Lily, for her part, carried the little wooden fox everywhere she went. It slept on her pillow and rode in her pocket, and was introduced to everyone she met as her favorite thing in the world. Clara never forgot her fear. It didn't disappear like magic. Some nights it still woke her up. A cold hand on her chest, a whisper in the dark. But she learned to do something with it that she had never been able to do before. She learned to feel the fear and look past it, to acknowledge it without obeying it, to hold it in one hand while reaching out with the other. The Modoc. Joseph never asked Clara for anything. Not gratitude, not love, not even friendship. He just kept being who he was, day after day, the same man in the sunlight and the same man in the dark. And that consistency, that unshakable steadiness, was the thing that finally taught Clara what she had never been taught before. That strength doesn't have to be violent. That masculinity doesn't have to be destructive. That a man can be powerful and gentle at the same time, and that the greatest power of all is the power to restrain yourself when you could easily push forward. Years later, when people in town asked Clara about the Modoc, she would smile in a way that told you everything you needed to know. She would say that he was the first man who ever showed her what love looked like when it wasn't trying to own you. She would say that he taught her the difference between a man who says he'll change and a man who simply is. She would say that the bravest thing she ever did was bring a pie to a cabin by the river, and the bravest thing he ever did was step back and let her come to him on her own terms. And if you asked the Modoc, he would say even less. He would look out at the river and the trees and the garden where his children, because they were his children now in every way that mattered, played in the dirt the way he had once played in the dirt of his grandmother's garden. And he would say that Ruth had been right, that the second path existed, that it was harder and longer and lonelier than the first, but that it led somewhere worth going. He would say that the best thing he ever did was the thing that looked like nothing. He stepped back, he stayed quiet, he let his life speak. And when Clara was finally ready to listen, what she heard was not a man defending himself or explaining himself or begging for a chance. What she heard was a life lived with integrity, day after day, year after year, a life that said without words, "This is who I am." Not who people say I am, not who fear made you think I am. This is who I am. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.